Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Nā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. I rise to take a call on the Supplementary Estimates Bill. Mr Speaker, this government's been a poor economic manager for the economy. We've seen it over successive budgets, no real plan for the economy, no real vision, no real emphasis on the things which matter, which is our children and what we're doing going forward. All we see from the government benches, their only plan is to drill it, mine it, frack it, cut it and sell it. That's it. We've seen over the last few years a number of terrible economic decisions that have been made. We've seen those unaffordable tax cuts which weren't cost neutral. We've seen poor transport spending. We've seen this government subsidising polluters. They're bailing out their mates from MediaWorks to Sky City to Warner Brothers. And when David Bennett asks, where from the opposition, what is out there? He asked the question, what is out there? But to quote from the popular TV show, what is out there is the truth. And you only have to look at those budget papers on that table to see the truth. What we see from the government and the last budget, which is what the supplementary estimates deal with, is a budget deficit of over $18 billion, a New Zealand record for a budget deficit. We see Crown debt rising to $13.4 billion, making that total Crown debt to $40 billion. That's poor economic management. And we've seen economic activity stagnate at levels just above a technical recession, and that is poor economic management. Now, Mr Speaker, the economic conditions around the world are concerning. We're facing a debt crisis globally. In New Zealand, it's particularly important given debt's expected to exceed $72 billion over the next few years. We've got a growing current account deficit that's at 4% of GDP, estimated to be around 7% of GDP in a few years. We've got massively growing inequality between our richest and poorest New Zealanders. We're seeing 270,000 Kiwi kids growing up in real poverty. We're seeing kids go to school without shoes, without breakfast, real poverty in a first world nation. But we're also seeing a lack of vision from the government. They've got no plan bar drill it, mine it, frack it, cut it and sell it. So what have the government done over the period they've been in government, which these supplementary estimates deal with? Well, we've seen the unaffordable tax cuts. In 2010, those tax cuts, which weren't cost neutral, delivered the biggest cuts to those New Zealanders who earned it or needed it the least. We saw the head of Westpac Bank getting $5,000 a week from tax cuts. And who's paying the bill? Well, it's those other Kiwis at the lower income levels who are paying it through increased GST, but it's also future generations who are paying for that $5,000 a week tax cut for the head of Westpac with borrowing. So it wasn't only fiscally reckless, it was also immoral, Mr Speaker. We've seen poor transport spending, which the Labour Party, it's good to see, has come to the party on about as well. Look, this government's somehow, in a time of austerity, facing the debt crisis, growing current account deficit, an $8 billion a year oil import bill, somehow found the ability to borrow $14 billion over 10 years for motorways with negative benefit cost ratios. Look, I'd get laughed out of a business board meeting, I'd get laughed out of a council meeting if I proposed a project with a benefit cost ratio of 0.6. When you're investing $1, you're losing 40 cents. But somehow this government, and particularly Stephen Joyce and Jerry Brownlee, have convinced the government and Bill English to find $14 billion to borrow to throw at these unaffordable motorways. We're seeing subsidies for polluters. This government has also found $1.5 billion in the last financial year and $800 billion in the next financial year's budget to subsidise polluters under their amended emissions trading scheme. We're not sending the right signal. We had Amy Adams go to Rio to rail against fossil fuel subsidies, but then she is quite happy to come back and talk to her cabinet ministers to keep this $1.5 billion and subsidies to polluters to continue. It is a subsidy, the taxpayer is paying for it, and what you're doing is sending the wrong economic signal, which is keep investing in polluting technology. Well, this government, in their books, has got that figure there. It's the taxpayer fronting up, funding polluters. But it doesn't stop there. We saw Tim Grosser in the House say he was quite happy for this government to subsidise risky deep-sea oil drilling with the $25 million free handout in the seismic survey. So when the government's railing against inefficient fossil fuel subsidies around the world, really they should look closer to home. Action begins at home. But, you know, Mr Speaker, despite all the risks of deep-sea oil drilling, it's not the only sector this government's helping out. There's a clear theme with this government, is that they're quite happy to help their mates out. You see it with the dodgy Sky City negotiations. Now, a convention centre isn't going to be a game changer. It isn't going to help our current account deficit. It isn't going to help lift us out of growth. It's not going to help with a huge number of jobs. And what it's going to be paid for is those low-income Aucklanders who are going to be paying for it out of their pockets with those pokey machines. They've got money to throw at Warners, they've got money to throw at MediaWorks. This government is all about helping their mates. They say they don't pick winners, but this government does pick winners, be it risky deep-sea oil drillers, the gamblers, or the other sectors in the economy, Mr Speaker. Now, with the drilling, which this government wants to stimulate, wants to aggressively promote, what we know from all the data is there's going to be hardly any jobs for New Zealanders, because they put all the jobs on the skilled shortage immigration list, hardly any taxes, because there's so many exemptions, hardly any royalties, because we've got one of the lowest royalty rates in the world. In fact, we've got the fourth lowest government take, or royalties plus tax rate in the world, fourth lowest rate. So we know we're going to see hardly any jobs for New Zealanders, hardly any taxes, hardly any royalties, and we know the profits are going to go offshore. What we would do is not sell the assets, which is what the government's doing. Now, what they've done is they've dug themselves a fiscal hole, and now what they're doing is selling the same tools which would get us out of it. These assets are returning healthy dividends, but what the government wants to do is some days they want to pay off debt, which doesn't make sense because the cost of borrowing is at an all-time low. Some days they want to invest in other sectors, like, again, more subsidies to their mates in the agricultural sector with a $400 million irrigation scheme. So what we would do, as Toh Henry keeps asking, what we would do is we would keep these assets, we would use them. We would use them and we would supercharge them, and we would use them to promote our environment and our economy. Because what our Environment Minister doesn't get is New Zealand's economy is dependent on our environment. There's a global green tech boom happening at the moment. It's predicted to be an $800 billion market in the next few years. For the first time ever last year, and I'm not sure if the government are aware of this, investment in renewable energy outstripped fossil fuels. It's the first time in our planet's history, Mr Speaker. But this government, for their inspirations, looking to the 19th century for their economic inspiration, not to the current century, which is going to be framed by those global challenges like climate change. We could be using our assets, we could be supercharging them, we could be at the forefront of the global green tech clean energy market. We could be using these SOEs like Mighty River Power to exporting that geothermal technology around the world. But this government wants to flog them off, to forego the dividends, but worse than that, they want the taxpayer to pick up for the tab. They want the taxpayer to fund around $120 million for PR spin doctors. They want to fund that $120 million for admin costs. They've got $400 million approximately for their loyalty scheme. Now, it's the wrong word to use for this loyalty scheme, Mr Speaker. What the loyalty scheme will be when we finally see the details and the government stops hiding in secret what they're embarrassed about, which is this loyalty scheme is going to be simply welfare to those New Zealanders who can already afford to buy shares. Again, it's going to be the taxpayer, those poorest New Zealanders, who are subsidising those New Zealanders that have the resources to be purchasing these shares. Welfare for the rich through the loyalty scheme. So, Mr Speaker, there is a better way. We could be supercharging our assets. We could be rebalancing our economy toward more sustainable production. Drill it, mine it, frack it isn't going to cut it in the 21st century. There's a whole host of smart green economics we could be using. There's a $6 trillion global green race, as Pure Advantage pointed out recently. We started in a wonderful position. We had such a head start over many other nations, but this government squandered their lead. They're looking to the 19th century for inspiration. We should be extending the insulation scheme. We should be increasing the minimum wage to $15. We should be boosting R&D. We should be putting a real price on carbon to promote a low-carbon economy. We should be reducing KiwiSaver accounts fees by having a public option. There's a whole host of things we could be doing. Drill it, mine it, frack it, cut it, sell it isn't in New Zealand's interests.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This, I firmly believe